Hello, and thank you for joining me. My name is Dr. Sharon Scambri, and I'm here today to talk about international business, working from the Charles Hill 2021 textbook titled International Business. We are still in the midst of part 2. Today we're going to focus in on chapter 4, and part 2 is all about national differences, and chapter 4 focuses in on culture. So let's share the screen here and we shall get going. Okay, so culture, one of my favorite topics. I'm a culture researcher, and this discussion today is all about national differences in culture. And basically the message that I want you to take away from this recording, from this theory on culture, is that culture matters. So specifically in Hill's chapter 4, we look at what is meant by the culture of a society. We look to identify the forces that lead to the differences in social culture. We seek to identify the business and economic implications of differences in culture and recognise how differences in social culture influence values in business. And of course, at the end of the chapter, as we usually do, we'll relate all of this back to the business implications. All right, so understanding and adapting to local culture is very important in the context of international business. Cultural competency refers to how well we understand cultural differences within countries and from country to country or not, right? And because we want to have cultural competency that's going to enable us to do a good job at business. It can even be a competitive advantage. So cultural differences create a common bond among people. There's numerous values and norms that are apparent in cultural systems, and these affect the way that business is conducted. And culture is dynamic. It can and does evolve. This is a picture of Singapore. Singapore is a little island next to Malaysia, in between Malaysia and Indonesia. And Singapore is a technologically advanced society. And they have a distinct culture. So what do we mean to say that Singapore has a distinct culture? Well, what we're talking about is a system of values and norms that is shared amongst a group of people that, when taken together, constitute a design for living. Now, what do we mean by values? What do we mean by norms? What do we mean by society? So values are the ideas about which a group believes to be good, right, and desirable. And Singapore has a distinct values and norms upheld within their society. Norms are about the social rules and guidelines that prescribe appropriate behaviour in particular situations. And when we mention society, we're talking about a group of people that share a common set of values and norms. So this picture on the slide here with Liberty in orange, in an orange sash across the diagonal there, this is a word cloud of the American Constitution. And so it's showing you the primary values that are evident in the American Constitution. And liberty showing up there as the primary value for America. So values provide the context within which a society's norms are established and justified. They are invested with emotional significance and they reflect the economic systems of society. Norms are social rules that govern people's actions toward each other. And two types of social norms that we can talk about or recognise are folkways and mores. Folkways are routine conventions of everyday life. So it's about how we interact with each other. And this includes, for example, ritualistic behaviour and symbolism. Mores are norms that are seen as central to the functioning of that society. And example of mores includes, for example, laws against theft. So mores have a greater moral significance than other norms. Other norms such as taboos, for example, talking about particular topics, engaging in particular behaviours in some societies are considered taboo. All right, so culture, society, and the nation, the country, there's a relationship between the society and the nation state. And it's not strictly one-to-one. Nations are political creations, and nations, within a nation, there can be evidence of several cultures. And a culture can be more broad than the nation. And we can also recognise that there's different levels of culture within a nation state. And again, emphasising that culture is dynamic. So culture evolves, it changes. And as international business operators, we need to be cognizant of these cultural dynamics. So this slide is telling us, it's giving us a list of the values and norms of a culture that might evolve over time. These are determinants of culture. We're talking about religion. We're talking about political philosophy, political persuasion. We're talking about economics, economic philosophy, economic systems, and then education, language, and social structure. So this is a graphic representation of that previous list. So religion and education, social structure, language, as well as politics and economics, these determinant factors influence the cultural norms and values of a national system. So let's look at each of those in turn now. Social structure refers to the basic social organisation of a society, and it's about primarily two dimensions. And these two dimensions of a social structure help us to understand the differences amongst cultures. So these two dimensions are the degree to which the basic unit of social organisation is oriented towards the individual or the group. And the second dimension of social structure is the degree to which the society is stratified into classes or maybe castes, as is the case with India. India is an example of a caste system. And this picture here is taken from the recently released movie called The White Tiger. And it's a story about the caste system in India. Of course, the critics are questioning how accurate the depiction is. But if you want to know more, then there's an entertaining option. All right. So social structure, we said the first dimension was about individual and group orientation. So in Western societies, the individual is the basic building block of social organisation. Emphasis on individualism, emphasis on individual achievement. Individual achievement is the priority. Whereas if the social structure is oriented more towards a group consideration, it's the group or the community that is important. So this group is where individuals have a shared sense of identity and interact in ways that will benefit the group rather than the individual. So we can recognize that there are cultural differences between the East and the West. So what do I mean East? Well, primarily we're talking about Asian cultures, including Indian cultures. And in the West, we're talking about developed nations such as America, Australia, and the UK. All right, so we've got a list here of the cultural differences between the East and the West. And second on the list is about the West having an individualist orientation, and go down the list, it's a short-term orientation, whereas the East is very much about community, communal orientation, and go down the list, it's a long-term orientation. So the East has a much higher emphasis on tradition than what the West does. Social stratification is about hierarchy and often based on family background, occupation, and income. And what we're suggesting here is that individuals born into a particular social stratum affects their life chances, affects their life trajectory. And sometimes it's not always positive, sometimes it's a negative. So, you know, people born in America have, you know, relative to the rest of the world, have quite an advantage in life, even though there are many people in America that live in poverty. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So there's 4 basic principles of social stratification. The trait of society, how much your social stratification carries over into the next generation. Social stratification is quite generally universal, but it can vary, and it involves not just inequality, but also beliefs. When we're talking about social stratification, we can recognize measures of social mobility to help us understand social stratification. So social mobility is the extent to which individuals can move out of the strata in which they were born, out of the social strata in which they were born. And of course, it varies from society to society. I mentioned the Indian caste system. Okay, so a caste system is a closed system where social mobility kind of doesn't exist. Social position is determined by family, and change is usually not possible. So India has 4 main caste systems, and I've got those 4 main caste systems here. And you'll notice outside of the 4 main caste systems at the bottom of this pyramid is the untouchables. And these are the street sweepers. These are the toilet cleaners in India. And if you're born into this particular caste in India, then I don't know what to say, but it's a very sad story. Okay. In the American system, there is definite classes in the American system, but as you can see here, the middle class and the working class make up the majority of American classes. And let's just say that the British system is actually more class-based than the American system. And relative to the rest of the world, 56% of Americans are in the world's highest income group, according to the Pew Research Center, and those statistics are based on 2011 statistics. They're suggesting that 56% of Americans live on more than $50 per day, as compared with 7% globally. So here we go. In the far right-hand column, you've got that 56% of Americans living as high-income earners as opposed to 7% globally. Go to the other extreme, and in America, you've got just 2% who are recognized as poor, so living on less than $2 a day. whereas globally that figure is 15%. Okay, so social stratification, we'll look at the significance of social stratification in terms of business and business operations. Class consciousness is relevant in terms of perceptions, you know, who are you? Where do you come from? These are important questions in terms of social stratification and indeed in terms of business. So social stratification makes it difficult to establish a global competitive advantage. All right. Now, we said one of the things apart from social stratification as a determinant of culture is religion. And this picture of the world here is showing us that there's 4 predominant religions in the world. Christianity, evident here in predominant across North America. Islam, predominant across Northern Africa. Buddhism, evident in parts of Asia, and Hinduism being the 4th globally dominant religion. And as we know, religion has implications for example, work ethic, and it has implications for the way that business is done, where business is done even. All right, language. Language is another determinant of culture. It's an indicator of culture. But language, we need to recognize spoken language as well as unspoken language. So language structures the way that we see the world. Some countries have more than one language, and countries with more than one language often have one culture. So in China, for example, there's many regional dialects, and from region to region, there will be a cultural variation. So while Mandarin is the mother tongue across China, it's recognized as such because it is the most predominant. There's also recognizable regional dialects. English is the world of business. English is the language of international business. Now, just as important as spoken language is non-verbal communication. Personal space is an example of non-verbal communication. So in high density populations, such as much of Asia, in Hong Kong, for example, the distance between a speaker and a listener is much closer. You know, that people are more comfortable to be very close because they're so used to high density living. Whereas that's not the case in, for example, America and Australia, right? We're used to vast spaces. So body language and body language acceptability is varying across cultures, and for people engaging in foreign markets, it behooves the business people to make sure that they're conversant with not only the language, but the cultural norms with regards to, for example, non-verbal language. Okay, education, another aspect or determinant of culture. So education is the medium through which individuals learn languages and acquire skills and knowledge. Education, formal education, socializes our younger populations into the values and the norms of society. So there's actually a hidden curriculum in schools that teaches respect for others, obedience to authority, honesty, neatness, and timeliness, for example. So education provides a national competitive advantage. And in Asia, there is a very high value placed on education, and the push towards educating their societies has enabled some Asian countries, such as Singapore, to scream ahead in terms of an educational advantage. So Singapore is an example where they have been able to achieve a competitive advantage on the world stage with regards to technological innovation. They deliberately created a pool of skilled and knowledgeable tech workers, and they invested in it. They, being the government, the Singaporean government, invested in it. And so now we've got big tech sort of congregating in Singapore, because that's where the infrastructure is. So they not only they being the Singaporean government, not only invested in education, and specifically tech education for their population, they invested in infrastructure. So Singapore has a strong technological infrastructure. Okay, now Gert Hofstede, he is responsible for the primary theory on the dimensions of culture, and his research puts forward 5 dimensions of culture. They've recently added a 6th in 2010 or thereabouts. But the 5 dimensions of Hofstede's cultural theory says, 1, power distance. So this refers to how a society deals with physical and intellectual capabilities. So it's about the power distance between the people, the everyday people, and the hierarchy, right? So is the power distance high or low? In some countries, it's very high. We'll talk about this. In some countries, it's quite low. Individualism versus collectivism. We've talked about this at length. Individualism, very strong in America. Collectivism, very strong in China. Uncertainty avoidance measures the extent to which different cultures socialize their members into accepting ambiguous situations and tolerating uncertainty or not, right? So how does a particular nation state measure on uncertainty avoidance? Masculinity versus femininity. So this measure looks at the relationship between gender and work roles. Some countries have very high measure of masculinity, America, for example. Some countries have a very low level of masculinity and essentially a very high measure of femininity. Nordic countries, for example. And in terms of leadership, this femininity measure on leadership has done Nordic countries very well, and indeed that might be considered part of their competitive advantage on the international stage. Long-term versus short-term orientation, we mentioned that just earlier, and looking at the differences between East and West cultures. So Eastern cultures are more likely to accept delayed gratification with their longer term focus, with their traditionalism focus, as opposed to Western countries with a shorter term orientation. And so that's the 5 dimensions of culture according to Hofstede. But as recently as 2010, a 6th dimension was added, and this is a measure of indulgence versus restraint. So indulgence refers to a society that allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to lifestyle, right? So, you know, how indulgent is this society or not? Or how much restraint does this society display in suppressing gratification of needs and the regulation of strict social norms. All right, so Western nations tend to score high on individualism and low on power distance, right? Low on power distance means that a worker, somebody who's not a manager or a supervisor, can have a conversation relatively easily with managers, executives, right? So the power distance is low. Whereas in Eastern nations, the power distance is high. A regular employee is not going to expect to be able to have a conversation with the manager, the executive, the CEO, because the power distance is high. Latin America and Asian countries have an emphasis on collectivism. So it's all about the community. It's all about what's best for the society as a whole. And I've just mentioned that high on the power distance for Asian countries. Japan demonstrates a high level of uncertainty avoidance. They want certainty, right? They don't want uncertainty. And they also rank high on masculinity. Okay. Hofstede's work, however, has been critiqued, and part of the critique is that it assumes a one-to-one correspondence between culture and the nation state, whereas we've already recognized, we've already mentioned today that many countries have more than one culture. There's a cultural variation in going from region to region. And research may be culturally bound. Research on culture may focus on a single industry. So here's a graphic depiction of the now 6 dimensions of Hofstede's cultural theory: power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. Okay. Right. So GLOBE is it's an instrument, it's a survey that has been used for many years throughout the world to measure global leadership and organizational behavior effectiveness, GLOBE for short. And the GLOBE research has identified that a leader's effectiveness is contextual because it's embedded in societal as well as organizational norms and values. And the GLOBE research has established 9 cultural dimensions to this point, at least. So it's more comprehensive than Hofstede's dimensions, because Hofstede began with 5 and now he's got an extra one, whereas the GLOBE research is identifying 9 cultural dimensions. The World Values Survey identifies even more dimensions, right? So they're trying to tease out the complexities of culture with this advancing research. And there's far more research than just these 3 that I've mentioned today. Okay. So I started out with the emphasis today in that culture matters, and that is the case. Culture matters. Part of why culture matters is because it's dynamic. It's not a constant. It evolves over time. And we can see this with the increasing amount of women, not only in the workforce, but in management. Research shows, however, that while women are making great strides in management and leadership, primarily the success or the advances in terms of women in management and women in leadership is most evident in traditionally non-male dominated industries. Now, part of why Kamala Harris's appointment to Vice President of the United States is so important is because her appointment has essentially presented as evidence that would contradict the suggestion that I've just made, right? So politics is an example of a traditionally male-dominated field, and now for the first time in history, we have a woman second in charge. Okay. In Japan, Japan, we've already said today, is recognized as a highly collectivist society, a collectivist culture, but there is evidence that Japan is evolving towards a more individualistic society. Part of what's going on in Japan is increasing wealth. Culture changes as the country becomes more wealthy. As a nation state industrializes, then cultural changes become evident. But we also have evidence throughout the world of counter trends. We have evidence of a shift towards Islamic fundamentalism in some countries, and Brexit is an example of a separatist movement. All right. Cultural competency matters in international business because cultural competency or not may well derive your level of business success. So cultural competency, a high level of cultural competency can mean a competitive advantage. Cultural competency means that you're able to move into foreign markets because you understand that culture. You're able to move into a foreign market and do a good job of conducting business in that foreign market because you have a depth of understanding the culture of that nation. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that American business owners and operators are known for is their ethnocentrism, their assumption that their culture is indeed superior to other cultures around the world. And there is much evidence of that in international business success stories, or not, failures, basically. All right, so part of what goes on in international businesses is that Americans bring their culture with them. And the American culture is recognized to be somewhat more informal, especially with regards to time. And that can be disadvantageous, misconstrued in the international business situation. All right. All right, so values and norms can influence the costs of doing business. Some say that modern Japan, the culture of modern Japan lowers the cost of doing business relative to Western nations, but part of why that is because culture in Japan is very traditionalist oriented, and the measure of uncertainty, they don't like uncertainty, right? They want to avoid uncertainty, so they have a high measure of uncertainty avoidance, and so certainty enables the cost of business to be lowered. But this graph, this picture that I'm showing you here is a link to Economist, a news item that was published in The Economist, and it's symbolically showing Prime Minister, the previous Prime Minister of Japan, who stepped down in September of 2020, Prime Minister Abe. He was in power for many years, and since the 70s, I think, and his attitude to entrepreneurialism was quite different to previous administrations, right? So here he is holding the hand of the Japanese entrepreneur who's, small in stature and kind of scared. He's showing the way. So he had more of an open attitude to innovation and entrepreneurialism, whereas the looming figure over the top of them both is the traditionalist view of Japan. So this is evidence in Japan that culture changes, culture is dynamic, and we'll see what happens in the years ahead. As we've mentioned previously, Japan has the distinct issue more than other countries of an aging population, with more than 20% of their population being 65 years or older, who are not necessarily contributing to the economy. They're not paying tax, and they're heavy users in terms of healthcare. Okay, so we can recognize that the connection between culture and competitive advantage is important for two reasons. It suggests that countries are likely to produce, which countries are going to produce the most viable competitors, right? So if innovation and entrepreneurialism is high in a particular country, then they may well produce the most viable competitors in a particular industry. Countries such as Nigeria, the entrepreneurialism coming out of Nigeria at the moment is amazing. So the measures of cultural dimensions for a particular country is part of what we need to consider when we, international business operators, are deciding which foreign countries to enter, where to locate production facilities, and even whether or not to do business with that particular nation state. So there you go. Thank you very much for your attention again today, and I hope you'll join me again soon.